The funeral was meant to be a solemn occasion. General Marcus Williams, a highly decorated officer in the military, was paying his respects to a fallen comrade. The cemetery was filled with grieving friends and family, all gathered to honor the life of a man who had served his country with pride. For Marcus, it was another day of loss, another day spent among the people who understood the sacrifices that come with a life of service. The air was thick with the smell of fresh flowers, the sound of distant sobs filling the silence. Marcus stood tall, his uniform sharp, his face stoic. He was used to being in the public eye, used to the respect that came with his rank. But as he stood there, something shifted in the atmosphere. The quiet murmurs of the mourners were interrupted by a tense figure approaching Marcus. A police officer, Officer Thomas Reynolds, had walked into the cemetery. From the moment Officer Reynolds locked eyes with Marcus, an undeniable tension filled the air. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Marcus instinctively felt the weight of the man's stare. He couldn't understand what was happening. The officer, appearing agitated, started moving closer, his hand hovering near his sidearm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but wary. But Officer Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his gun. The funeral, a moment of peace and remembrance, had turned into a nightmare. Marcus, realizing the danger he was in, stood his ground, his military training taking over as he evaluated the situation. He never expected a peaceful event to spiral into something so threatening, especially not in front of his fellow soldiers and loved ones. As Officer Reynolds moved closer, his hand remained fixed on his gun. The crowd, previously subdued by grief, began to stir with confusion and fear. People whispered among themselves, unsure of what was happening, but everyone felt the unmistakable tension in the air. General Williams, who had stood tall through countless military conflicts, felt an unfamiliar surge of adrenaline. The officer, seemingly enraged by something unknown, was advancing toward him with obvious hostility. "Step back, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "There's no need for this." Reynolds did not respond to Marcus's words. Instead, his hand tightened around the grip of his gun. The officer's eyes were wide with a mix of anger and something darker, something that Marcus couldn't quite place. It didn't make sense. Marcus, a high-ranking military officer, had been in countless dangerous situations before, but never had he been so openly threatened in such a setting. At a funeral of all places, the tension was unbearable. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to assess the threat. The officer was clearly unstable, but what was driving him? What had set Reynolds off in such a public, sacred space? Before Marcus could react further, the situation escalated. A few bystanders, noticing the officer's movements, began to shout for help. Others tried to intervene, but Officer Reynolds was in a state of aggression that made him unpredictable. With no clear explanation for his actions, he seemed intent on provoking Marcus, perhaps for reasons tied to personal prejudice. As the situation continued to spiral out of control, bystanders who had witnessed the escalating tension began to call for backup. The chaos at the funeral quickly drew attention from law enforcement officers who were stationed nearby. Some of the mourners, fearing for their lives, began to retreat, unsure of how things would unfold. General Williams, however, remained calm. His military training had taught him to handle high-pressure situations, and although his heart raced, he kept his composure. He was acutely aware of the fact that the officer had drawn his weapon, and the longer this went on, the more likely it was that someone would get hurt. In that moment, the cavalry arrived, but not in the way Marcus expected. A senior officer from the local police department, Lieutenant Claire Douglas, had heard the commotion and quickly rushed to the scene. Seeing Officer Reynolds standing with his gun drawn and Marcus unarmed in front of him, Lieutenant Douglas acted swiftly. "Reynolds, put the gun down," she ordered, her voice firm. "Now!" The sight of a higher-ranking officer giving a direct order shook Reynolds from his blind anger. For a moment, it seemed as if he might hesitate, but the presence of Lieutenant Douglas gave Marcus the opening he needed. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the officer, while other officers arrived to secure the area and disarm Reynolds. In the aftermath of the shocking incident, the truth slowly began to emerge. It didn't take long for law enforcement to investigate the circumstances surrounding Officer Reynolds' actions. Eyewitnesses who had been present at the funeral began to provide testimony. Many described the officer's behavior as erratic and unnecessarily aggressive. Several people who had witnessed the confrontation, including other law enforcement officers, confirmed that there had been no provocation from General Williams. In fact, some even testified that Officer Reynolds had made racially charged remarks earlier in the encounter, fueling suspicions that the officer's actions were motivated by racial prejudice. The investigation revealed that Officer Reynolds had a history of complaints against him for inappropriate behavior, including previous instances of racial profiling. What had started as an isolated incident at the funeral was now part of a larger pattern of discrimination that had gone unchecked for far too long. It was clear that Reynolds' actions were not just an isolated lapse in judgment, they were indicative of deeper issues within the local police force. The weight of the evidence quickly shifted the case into the courts, with public outcry growing stronger as people demanded justice for Marcus Williams and accountability for Reynolds. Officer Reynolds' trial was highly publicized, and the evidence was overwhelming. The racial bias that had motivated his actions was undeniable, and his violent confrontation with General Williams at a funeral had shocked the public and law enforcement alike. In a landmark ruling, Reynolds was convicted of multiple charges, including assault, racial discrimination, and attempted murder. The judge handed down a sentence that would forever change Reynolds' life, a life sentence without the possibility of parole. As Reynolds was escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and defeated, General Williams sat in the audience, his expression solemn. The outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the damage caused by the officer's actions would linger for a long time. In the months following the trial, Marcus became an outspoken advocate for police reform and racial justice. He worked alongside community leaders to raise awareness about the systemic issues of racism within law enforcement, using his position to push for meaningful change. The incident at the funeral, while tragic, had sparked a movement for justice that continued to grow. While Officer Reynolds rotted in prison, Marcus Williams honored his fallen comrades by ensuring that the fight for justice was carried forward, ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate he had at the hands of a racist officer.